Today, let's talk about a sweet dilemma we all face every day: sugar. We know that eating too much sugar isn't good. It brings health burdens like metabolic and chronic diseases. But the more interesting question is, why is our brain so greedy for it? Even when we know the consequences, that urge to eat is often irresistible. Today, we are going to dive into the research to decode a central concept: neuropathic gluttony. We'll use this idea to understand the dangers of sugar and the seemingly inescapable dependency we have on it.
Welcome and introduction to the topic. Welcome to the show. Today, we're going to look at some data shared with us by our listeners. All this information revolves around one central topic: sugar, something we encounter almost every day but rarely stop to think through deeply. Yes, of course, we probably all know that consuming too much sugar isn't great, that it burdens the body and so on. But what makes this data more interesting is where it digs deeper. It asks, why are we so greedy for sugar? Even though we know the potential consequences aren't good, that craving is often irresistible. So, today, we're going to sift through these sources together, focusing specifically on a term they repeatedly mention: neuropathic gluttony. We want to use this concept as a starting point to understand the dangers of sugar and that seemingly inescapable dependency we have on it. Alright, let's begin. The shift from sugar's effects to eating behavior. The source material is quite clear: consuming too much sugar leads to a host of health problems, metabolic issues, chronic diseases, and there is a wealth of scientific research on this, all mentioned in the sources. But, as you just said, the interesting part is they shift the focus from what sugar itself does to the behavior of why we keep eating it. The root of the behavior? Yes. And then they introduce the term neuropathic gluttony. This sounds like a term borrowed from fields like neuroscience or psychology, used to describe a very intense desire for a specific food, clearly sugar, in this context, not just ordinary hunger, and a compelling urge to consume it. Wow, this makes us think that the problem might not just be the sugar's composition itself, but that our brain and sugar seem to have formed a special connection, perhaps even a solidified neural circuit. Thinking about it this way is quite intriguing. So, the key is not merely that sugar causes weight gain or is unhealthy, but something deeper: why does my brain seem to be hijacked by it? Yes, that's the feeling. The term neuropathic gluttony you just mentioned sounds like a key to unlocking this mystery. Defining neuropathic gluttony. So, according to these sources, what exactly does it mean? How do they define it? The sources seem to emphasize that this is a type of gluttony related to how our nervous system operates. This elevates the issue of excessive eating from what we might previously have considered a lack of willpower or self-control to a more physiological and mechanistic level. Could it be that the intense craving we feel for dessert sometimes genuinely can't be resolved just by saying, "I must endure it"? Yes, that's precisely the main point the sources want to convey. The most thought-provoking aspect here is the source's suggestion that what we typically call greed or gluttony may not just be a vague desire or a weakness of character. It might be a concrete physio-psychological state that can be described and understood using scientific terminology, such as neuropathic gluttony. So, there's a mechanism operating behind it. Yes, they mentioned that scientific research might focus on micro-level details, such as how sugar molecules affect liver cells or how blood sugar spikes. That's very microscopic, but what these sources want to do is connect those point discoveries to a larger behavioral pattern that's seemingly uncontrollable: gluttony. They want to answer why? Why does our brain seem to push us to eat these things, even when we know the risks? The sources also specifically state that the concept of neuropathic gluttony is not something they made up. It has a medical research background. They are essentially trying to leverage this observed scientific phenomenon to more powerfully advocate for the dangers of sugar and how we should address the problem. They feel this is an excellent entry point. The vicious cycle and the power of conditioning. Let me summarize the logic. First, the sources say that consuming too much sugar causes problems. That's the undesirable result. Then, they say we keep eating because part of the reason is an internal state called neuropathic gluttony. This acts like an engine or a driving force pushing us to eat. Does this sound like it could become a vicious cycle? For example, I eat sugar, the neural circuit is temporarily satisfied, but that satisfaction also seems to strengthen the circuit, making me crave it even more next time? That's very likely how the mechanism operates. And the sources mention a term I find very interesting: this gluttony is conditioned, literally smoked out or habituated. This sounds like it implies a strong influence from postnatal learning, habit, and environment. The term conditioned is well used. Does this also mean there is hope? If this neuropathic gluttony can be conditioned into a bad state, couldn't it also be conditioned back into a healthy one using the right methods? You've made a great connection. The source's wording indeed hints at that more positive possibility, that if it can be conditioned into a bad state, perhaps it can be conditioned into a good one. This brings up a crucial question: if this eating behavior we find so hard to control is really tied tightly to specific neural circuits or psychological mechanisms in our brain, then will a deeper understanding of the mechanism itself, how it's triggered, what strengthens it, and how it operates be the first step toward finding a way to change it? Like fixing a machine requires first understanding its blueprint. Yes, you need to understand how it runs to know where to adjust, intervene, or even retrain it. The principle of verifiability science meets self-observation. This also connects to a fascinating point raised in the sources. They observe that there seems to be a common core principle: recurrent verifiability between rigorous scientific research and certain in-depth systems that examine our inner experience. The sources use the term dharma, referring to Buddhist teachings, but we can understand it more broadly as a method that emphasizes self-observation, experience, and verification. Introspective observation? Yes. How should we understand this? It means that whether you are in a lab, controlling all the conditions, and observing that A leads to B, for example, giving a stimulus causes a neural cell response, or we are in our daily lives observing cause and effect relationships through our own experience. For example, every time I'm stressed, I crave sweets. Eating them feels better temporarily, but the problem remains in the long run, and I feel regretful and physically unwell afterward. Oh, I see. One is objective experimentation, and the other is subjective experience, but both lead to verification. Essentially, both are phenomena you can observe, experience, and to some extent, replicate. Science verifies with instruments and data, while the latter relies on our own awareness and self-reflection for verification. The sources seem to suggest that we can also understand gluttony and its consequences, like the sugar-related diseases or distress mentioned, using this spirit of observation and verification. Wow, this perspective is truly inspiring. So, if I connect them, on one hand, we can rely on objective scientific evidence like the studies cited on how damaging sugar is, or the neuroscience psychology papers exploring neuropathic gluttony. We use the science part, yes. We use these to understand the severity of the problem and its potential physiological and psychological basis. On the other hand, we can also use self-observation and reflection to verify this behavioral pattern, how that gluttony operates in myself and what the consequences are. Exactly. And, as you just said, since it might be conditioned, understanding this mechanism could genuinely open the door to finding ways to change it to condition a healthier pattern. This feels more empowering. Instead of feeling completely helpless, dragged along by desire. Yes, understanding itself is a form of empowerment. A strategy for deeper understanding: the oil well analogy. Speaking of research, the sources offer a piece of advice I find very practical. They suggest that instead of talking broadly about healthy eating, we should focus our energy and concentrate deeply on a specific point. For instance, binding the dangers of sugar and neuropathic gluttony together, then seeking out authoritative papers on this combined theme, truly understanding and mastering them. This sounds like a strategy to make the argument more powerful? Yes. This is absolutely a communication strategy, but it's also a way to genuinely understand the problem. Instead of skimming the surface, the sources suggest we drill an oil well. Drill an oil well? Yes. Select the core issue you believe is most critical here. They clearly deem it the danger of sugar and the underlying driver, neuropathic gluttony, and then focus your resources and energy to dig deep and drill through it. The benefits of this approach are clear. First, your argument will be solid and persuasive because you're not just shouting slogans, you're basing your claims on specific, verifiable scientific research. The sources even suggest citing the research findings of highly credible institutions like the National Academy of Sciences (NAS). That makes people more likely to be convinced. Yes, it greatly increases credibility. Second, for ourselves, this kind of in-depth drilling leads to a more thorough understanding. If we happen to be struggling with this issue ourselves, that deep understanding might be the very key to breakthrough. At the same time, when you need to explain or promote this concept to others later, you can speak more clearly and with greater confidence. That makes a lot of sense. Focus leads to depth, depth leads to true understanding, and true understanding leads to a powerful message. Moreover, if you take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective, these sources seem to be doing something I think is quite valuable. Oh, what is that? They are trying to integrate knowledge from different disciplinary fields. You see, to understand sugar and neuropathic gluttony, you need medical knowledge to know sugar's effects on the body, metabolism, endocrinology, and even brain function. Yes. Then you probably need neuroscience knowledge to know which brain regions and which neurotransmitters are involved. Yes, which circuits participate in this feeling of gluttony. And finally, you might also need psychology knowledge. How habits are formed, why we crave food when stressed. Exactly, how cognition regulates impulse. Looking at any single discipline alone might only explain a part, but when you merge the insights and findings from these different fields, you get a much more complete picture. Yes, you have the opportunity to gain a more comprehensive, three-dimensional image to explain a phenomenon as complex as the strong craving for sugar. This might also explain why sometimes relying only on willpower or advice from a single discipline often proves insufficient. Conclusion and self-reflection. Alright, after this process of sorting and discussion today, it's very clear that the information you've shared indeed elevates the seemingly simple issue of sugar to a deeper, more complex level. It's no longer just about calories, weight, or cavities. The core concept of neuropathic gluttony provides a very useful angle, I think, to help us understand why that urge for sugar is so strong, sometimes feeling entirely beyond our control. The feeling of being compelled, yes. It directly connects our eating behavior to the deep-seated operation of the nervous system and psychological mechanisms. That's certainly true. The data we've reviewed together today presents a highly integrative perspective. On one hand, they strongly emphasize the need to rely on rigorous scientific research like studies on the physiological effects of sugar and papers related to neuropathic gluttony to understand the effect the harm of sugar and its cause the underlying driving mechanism. But on the other hand, they also remind us to pay attention to the deeper motivation behind the behavior, the greed that repeatedly appears in the sources, representing that innate, potentially neural circuit-related driving force. So, what does all this mean for our listeners? These sources seem to be telling us that if we truly want to address the various health problems caused by excessive sugar consumption effectively, merely knowing the downsides of sugar may not be enough. The more crucial step might be to understand and recognize the root cause that keeps pushing us to eat, especially this internal force the sources call neuropathic gluttony. Exactly. Becoming aware of this might give us a better sense of direction when looking for solutions, keeping us from just spinning our wheels on the surface. Well said. Understanding is often the first step toward change. Finally, here is a question that might be worth pondering in the time ahead. If our intense, seemingly irresistible craving for certain foods, like sugar, is truly to a significant extent rooted in this neuropathic mechanism and not merely a sign of weak willpower or lack of self-control, how would this single piece of knowledge change the way you look at your own related eating habits? And how would it affect your understanding or your attitude towards similar behaviors in others around you? This may be a direction well worth our continued exploration, a journey that goes beyond simple dietary rules and into the deeper realms of self-understanding and behavioral management.